This is reading commentary on Francois Furet's Pensée la Révolution Française, or Thinking the French Revolution. You read an excerpt from Furet's book, and I wanted to sort of place it in context and help to explain it, because Furet is doing an awful lot in that very short essay, and some of it is really not what we need to talk about, but some of it's very much what we need to talk about. So I want to sort of separate out the different things that Furet is talking about. First of all, Furet starts off talking about de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French nobleman who was, he wrote Democracy in America in the 1830s, which was a book about, he toured the United States and he sort of talked about how democracy functioned in the United States. And de Tocqueville is sort of recognized as a sociologist before there were sociologists. He was sort of analyzed society to see how power functioned and how things worked. For our purposes here, de Tocqueville made an interesting observation when he talked about the French Revolution. He said that the French Revolution, everybody talks about the French Revolution as if it was this major break in history, that everything before that was different and everything after that was different. But de Tocqueville says there's actually a lot of continuity through the revolution. What he means by that is that he says, if you look at the 1600s and the 1700s, one of the dominant themes of history at that time was that the French king was centralizing power. He was taking more and more power to himself. You know, coming out of the Middle Ages, the French state was fairly decentralized. The king was fairly weak, and local nobles like dukes and counts had enough power that they could just sort of ignore the king and tell him to go away. And so there was nobody who had a lot of centralized power. But over the course of the 1600s and 1700s, the French monarchy had gradually taken power away from those dukes and counts and big aristocrats and had solidified it in the office of the king. And de Tocqueville says, if you look at what happens in the French Revolution, he says, okay, before the French Revolution you have the king trying to solidify power and really gather power and centralize around himself, and then the French Revolution happens and the king is out. But the French Revolution ends with Napoleon, and Napoleon creates an even more centralized state. And if you look at the government since the French Revolution, it has become more and more centralized and more bureaucratic and efficient. And so de Tocqueville says, actually the French Revolution was not a break and everything stopped and something new began. In fact, what happens in the French Revolution is a process that was already happening, accelerated during the French Revolution. That the French Revolution cleared away a bunch of the things that were sort of getting in the way of this process, so the process sped up. Okay, Furet likes that idea, and in particular, he picks up one idea of de Tocqueville's, and that is that the French government was collecting power into its own hands. The monarchy was collecting power in its own hands, and it was excluding everybody else from exercising any kind of power. And there's something to that. That the monarchy really had this monopoly on power, and because, and I mean, the king could make laws, and the king had a cabinet of people who made all these big decisions, and they really took input from nobody else, right? There were no elections, they didn't really have any mechanisms whereby the king could find out what the people wanted or anything like that. And so power was sort of this black box that nobody outside of the government knew what was going on, what discussions were happening, what the government was thinking about. Because the king controlled, you know, everything that was going on in the government, and they didn't have to tell anybody what was happening. And I talked a little bit about that the king, the government was sort of seen as the king's own household. It was his business and nobody else's. So, in other words, what Furet takes from Tocqueville here, is that if you looked at the situation before the French Revolution, there were lots of people who had opinions about what the government should be doing and what's happening in society, but they had no way to make those opinions known to the government. And the government was sort of this tower, this black box that was sealed, and it was doing all sorts of things, but it wasn't listening to anything outside of it. So the monarchy had consolidated power so much that nobody else was actually had anything to do with power. And this is the key point that Furet wants to make, is that, you know, in our society, there's city governments, and people can run for a city council and whatever, and get involved in a little bit of city government, and they can run for state representative, and they can you know, there's all sorts of ways you can influence events. You can join nonprofits, you can join political campaigns, etc. And people through this process learn how to exercise power. They learn how government works. They learn how things function. But Furet is saying that because the French monarchy had so centralized government, there's this small number of people who really know how government functions, and then everybody else in French society has no experience of this, right? They're just cut out of it. They can't, they don't see how the process works. They can't take part in the process. They can't talk to people who are in the processes. They're cut out of it. And so what Furet says, and here we're done with Tocqueville for a minute, but Furet goes on, he says, well, if you look at what happened then, he says, in the Enlightenment, and I'll talk about the Enlightenment from Monday's lecture, in the Enlightenment you have all sorts of people talking about all sorts of new topics. In particular, people start talking about politics quite a bit. In the Enlightenment, they have the salons, and there's newspapers and coffee shops, and people are talking about stuff all the time, but none of them have any actual experience of what's going on, right? And so what you have then, Furet says, is you've got this small number of people in the government who actually know how the government functions and how decisions are made, and know how to move the levers of power, and they're not talking to anybody outside of that. And then you have this huge population of the country who's talking about politics all the time, but they have no idea how it works, and they have no experience with actually running a government because they've been cut out of the process. Okay? And so instead of having sort of practical knowledge of how government works and practical discussions of policies and things, instead what this public sphere, when people are just talking about politics, they get very abstract. They have no real concrete knowledge of what's going on, so they're just they're waving their hands a lot and they're making big ideas. And in particular, you get a whole bunch of big political theories about how government ought to work right. And one in particular that Furet will talk about more, he doesn't really talk about it in this article that I had you read, but that's an excerpt from his book, and he talks about it later in the book. He says in particular you had people like Rousseau, I'll talk about next week. Rousseau had this idea of the general will. He said that government gets its power from the people who agree to be governed. And Rousseau thought that the people had a unitary opinion, and that they knew what they wanted. And Rousseau, I'll talk more about why Rousseau thought that, but Rousseau thought that if you had a bunch of people who honestly wanted what was good for society or good for the group, they would really all agree because they all had good intentions, and it would be obvious what was good for society. So Rousseau thought that there was a general will, a single unified will that represented what the people wanted. Right? And you can see how this is kind of abstract, right? This is kind of, because if you'd ever actually been to a city council meeting, you would know that people can argue about everything, right? But Rousseau argued that there was this thing called the general will. And more generally, people assumed there was something called opinion, public opinion. They thought it was kind of coherent, that there was a public opinion, not lots of public opinions, but a public opinion. And the reason they believed that sort of unitary opinion is because everybody was sort of in their own little world. You know, they had their own little group of people they talked about, and nobody was really getting out there and actually trying to do policy where they would run into people who disagreed with them, right? They weren't actually trying to enact anything and getting opposition. So they assumed that the will of the people was a pretty easy thing to understand, right? That the will of the people was something real and unitary, and you could sort of act on it and understand it, right? So and you'll notice here that Furet is not talking about different social classes. He's talking about ideas, right? And in particular, Furet says then Furet says in particular the general will is an idea. It's a way of talking about what the people want, or it's a way of talking about democracy that makes a bunch of assumptions. It assumes there's a single public will. It assumes that everybody is aware of what the facts are and is aware of what's going on. It assumes that everybody will agree. And so it's a way of thinking about power and democracy that's kind of born in a vacuum. Has very little relationship to reality, but because nobody had any concrete experience of actually running a government, it seemed reasonable to them, right? Well, Furet then says what happens in the French Revolution is that essentially the French government just collapses because it goes bankrupt in 1788-89. This is a crisis, and basically the king just said, I mean, for all intents and purposes, what's happening here is the king is saying, I can't run the country anymore, I don't know how to do this, I don't know when a way out, and so the king just sort of stops. And this creates a vacuum. right? This creates a sort of political vacuum. Suddenly there's nobody running the country, right? And into that vacuum, you have lots and lots of people, the National Assembly and everybody in Paris, and everybody's talking about stuff, lots and lots of people, and they suddenly are in a position where they can actually make government policy and control the government, but they have no experience in how to do it. And so what Furet is saying is that they fall back on these ideas that they had going in, right? These abstract ideas. And in particular, they thought that what had happened in the revolution was that power had transferred to the people. And so they tended to think, because they'd read their Rousseau, they tended to think of the government as representing the people. And the government should act on what the people want. The government should respond to the general will. The government should respond to opinion. Okay? And Furet makes it clear, because they had read Rousseau and they had these ideas that sort of come out of abstract ideas, they assumed that there was a single unified public opinion. Right? That the people wanted something. Right? And again, you'll notice there's no talk of social classes here. Right? So Furet says what happens then is that all these revolutionaries in the National Assembly and the revolutionary government, etc., they think that government's job is to answer to the people. And each one of them has an idea of what the people want, right? Each one of them knows what the people want, or at least they think they do. But they really don't have any way, they don't have any opinion polls, they don't have any way to find out what the people want. They're just sort of guessing what the people want. And so what actually happens is, in the National Assembly, you have all these political factions. Each one thinks they know what the people want. But they have to convince everybody else that they know what the people want. Or they have to convince everyone else that what they want is what the people wants. And so what you get is this weird sort of theater, Furet says, that basically in the National Assembly, everybody is standing up and claiming to speak for the people. Everyone is claiming that they know what the people want. They know what the general will is. And so to get power in the government suddenly, all you have to do is present a convincing case that you speak for the people. Right? That's a very interesting problem, that suddenly you have all these people claiming to speak for the people. How do you decide? Without public opinion polls and things like that, how do you know what the people want? Right? And again, there's an assumption here that what the people want is one thing, right? That the public opinion, the general will, is a single thing. Right? You can be right and wrong and not wrong or wrong. Right? And so there's no sense that different factions of the people might have different opinions and might want different things, because the assumption is that if everybody wants what's good for the group, and they're all rational and level-headed, they should all agree on what's good for the group. Right? So there must be one public opinion out there. But there's a logic here that Furet says plays out. There's a logic written into this idea of the general will. And that is, if you believe that the people have a single opinion, and you know that and you believe that people will arrive at that opinion because they want what's good for the country, and you know you want what's good for the country, then you can be pretty sure that your opinion must match the people's opinion. Because if the people want what's good for the country and you want what's good for the country, clearly you guys must agree, right? And so everybody sort of assumes that they represent the people. But how do you deal then, if this is your logic, that these are your assumptions, how do you deal with the fact that other people disagree with you? How do you deal with the fact that some people want different policies than you do? How do you deal with the fact that some people totally disagree with you on what should be in the Constitution? How do you deal with the fact that some people disagree with you on who's the villain and who's the hero? How do you deal with disagreement? Right? And what Furet's point is that because this culture, these political ideas, Rousseau and others, had developed in this vacuum with no practical connection to reality of governing, when they actually get pushed into governing, they can't make reality fit their ideas, right? Reality just doesn't fit. and yet these are the ideas they have in their heads. So how do you make that work? Well, the last part of the article is the Furet points out that really for the first time in history, people had assumed that people are now assuming that history is made by the people, by people doing things, right? Before this, there had been the assumption that the king had become, I mean, this had been part of the official line of the government, that the king was the king because God wanted him to be king. So to a certain extent, history is out of people's hands. God made things happen, right? But now, with the revolution, it's clear the people have made things happen. The people are doing what they want to do. And so now there's an understanding that history happens because people are choosing things, right? Well, you put all these together, all these ideas together, Furet says, and what you get is this, that everybody who's in part of the revolution thinks that public opinion is a unitary thing, and because everybody who wants what's good for the country should agree on what's good for the country. And I want what's good for the country, so everybody thinks they represent public opinion. And if somebody disagrees with me, or if things go wrong in history, it must be because those people over there don't agree with me. And I know I want what's good for the country, so those people must not want what's good for the country. Right? By the very fact that they disagree with me, they are showing that, and because I want what's good for the country, if they disagree with me, they must not want what's good for the country. Right? And so they are, by that very fact of disagreeing with me, showing that they don't want what's good for the country, which makes them a traitor. And so anybody who does anything that disagrees with me is really some sort of traitor conspiring against the nation, because I want what's good for the nation. If you're fighting against me, you're fighting against what's good for the nation. You're fighting against the nation. You're a plotter and a conspirator. You're a traitor. And Furet says that this logic, this line of thinking that comes out of this culture that emerged out of the Enlightenment leads to the conclusion that the only way to handle political division is to get rid of all the people who disagree with you, because they clearly don't represent the people, and you do. Right? This leads to the terror. This leads to the mass executions. This leads to all the guillotine going night and day. This leads to Robespierre seizing power for himself. All these revolutionaries honestly believe, Furet says, that they want what's good for the people, and nobody can disagree with them without not wanting what's good for the people, and so the people who disagree with them are traitors. And so Furet says the whole revolution from 1789 up through the terror is sort of the playing out of this logic that comes out of Rousseau. All right? So a couple notes on Furet. First of all is he is trying to understand the mindset of the people who are taking part in the revolution. He basically says, instead of focusing on social classes and economics and all that, he totally, in other parts of the book that you didn't read, he totally dismisses the Marxist interpretation of history. He says, it really wasn't about social classes. When you look closely, the people leading the revolution don't represent the bourgeoisie. They certainly don't represent manufacturers and new merchants, etc. And he says, there are aristocrats on the side of the revolutionaries, and the whole class thing just doesn't quite work when you really get down to the nitty-gritty. And so instead, Furet says, let's try to understand what people thought they were doing, right? How did they understand the situation? In particular, what was their thought process? What were their assumptions? What were their key ideas? And how did that lead to the conclusions that they came to? And then let's see how that shaped their actions. Right? So Furet thinks the way to understand the French Revolution is not to look at which groups are fighting which groups and who's attacking whom, but rather to say, what are the ideas that are shaping the way people think about this? Because ideas shape action, according to Furet. And that's one of the key differences here. The Marxists think economics shapes action. That people, if they're in the working class, they have to act certain ways because their economic situation demands that of them, or makes them need these things. And if they're rich, they have to defend their wealth, and so that makes them act in certain ways. So for Marxists, the economic reality dictates action. For Furet, and we'll see Baker after him and some other post-structuralists that I'll talk about, it's the ideas that shape the action, that the way people think about things leads them to come to certain conclusions. It shapes their thought process and leads them to certain conclusions, so they act on their ideas or on their understanding of the situation. And this is not, Furet is pointing to Rousseau. We'll see that with some other people, other post-structuralists, they begin to not focus on political ideology so much or political theory. They're more focused on what we would call cultural assumptions. What does the king mean? What do people think it means to be king? Why is the king important, right? Or what do people mean when they say liberty, right? What do they mean when they say justice? What do they mean when they say equality? So you're focusing on the ideas and seeing how those ideas shape the way people think, which shapes the way they act. And for a lot of this, then, the post-structuralists tend to focus on language. What's the language people use, and how does that show us the assumptions underlying their thought processes? How does that show us the logic of their thought processes? So Furet represents a different approach than the Marxists. And I want you to just think about them, because in your first reading response, you can sort of compare Furet to the Marxists and say, which one seems more realistic to you? Which one seems to sort of capture history? Or maybe you want to take some of both, or maybe you want to try to incorporate both together. I just want you to think about it and see what you can do with that. And then later on, we'll add some more layers or some more theories with Tackett and Andrus, and then we'll add, and then Baker comes in a little later. He sort of elaborates on Furet. So that's the reading commentary on Furet.